The man pulled into the gravel parking lot just off Route 102, his tires crunching on the mix of small stones and fallen leaves. The lot was nearly empty this late in the season, just his pickup truck and a beat-up Honda Civic with Vermont plates. He stepped out into that crisp New England air, the kind that smells like damp earth and wood smoke this time of year, and zipped up his fleece jacket against the October chill. The trailhead wasn't much to look at, just a simple wooden kiosk with a faded map under plexiglass and a rusted metal donation box bolted to the side. A hand-painted sign read, Mount Monadnock State Forest, in peeling white letters. He'd been here before, years ago, back when his knees didn't creak like these old floorboards. The parking fee was now $5, up from $3 last time, so he fed a 5 into the slot, not bothering with the envelope system they'd implemented. The path started off easy, wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side, covered in that particular New England mix of pine needles and oak leaves. Sugar maples lined the trail, their famous fiery red leaves just past peak, but still putting on a decent show. Every so often, a yellow birch interrupted the lineup, its papery bark peeling in curls. The ground was littered with acorns from the white oaks, each one making a satisfying crunch when stepped on. About a quarter-mile in, the trail split, left toward the summit, 4.2 miles, the sign said, or right around the easier pond loop. He went right, not feeling particularly ambitious today. The path narrowed and began following an old stone wall, the kind you see everywhere in New England, built by farmers 2 centuries ago and now just part of the scenery. Lichen covered most of the granite stones, with occasional patches of moss filling the gaps where mortar might have been. The air smelled different here, less like leaves and more like wet rocks and pine. White pines towered overhead, their long needles creating a soft carpet on the forest floor. A red squirrel chattered angrily from one of the branches before darting up the trunk and disappearing. The trail dipped slightly as it approached the pond. Not really a pond, more of a large vernal pool that stuck around most of the year. The water was dark brown from all the tannins, with a few yellowed lily pads floating near the edges. A lone duck, probably a mallard, paddled slowly across the far side, ripples spreading behind it. He sat on one of the flat rocks near the water's edge, the kind of spot that would be crowded with families in summer, but was deserted now. The rock was cold through his jeans. A few late-season mosquitoes buzzed around, but weren't really biting. From somewhere in the distance came the call of a blue jay, that familiar harsh screech that always sounds vaguely annoyed. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the leaves still clinging to the beeches. Their pale yellow leaves always hung on longer than the maples. After a while, he didn't check his watch. He got up and brushed the pine needles from his pants. The walk back was the same as the walk in, just in reverse. Same stones in the wall, same acorns underfoot, same gradual incline that made his calves notice they were working. Back at the parking lot, his truck was now the only vehicle. He tossed his half-full water bottle onto the passenger seat and started the engine, the radio automatically picking up the local NPR station talking about apple picking season. As he pulled onto Route 102, heading toward Keene, he glanced in the rear view at the trailhead sign shrinking behind him. It had been exactly what he expected. A quiet walk in the woods. Nothing more. nothing less. Just another autumn afternoon in southern New Hampshire. The man pulled off Route 9 onto the dirt road leading to the trailhead, his tires kicking up small stones that pinged against the undercarriage. The October sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows through the mixed hardwood forest typical of western Massachusetts. A wooden sign with peeling green paint marked the entrance to October Mountain State Forest in uneven block letters, the state's largest tract of wild land that nobody ever seemed to visit. He parked in the empty lot beside the old iron gate that hadn't been closed in decades, its hinges rusted solid. The air smelled of decaying leaves and wood smoke from some distant chimney. A faded trail map under plexiglass showed the various paths winding through the 16,000-acre forest. But he already knew where he was going. The easy loop around Finnerty Pond, about 3 miles with minimal elevation gain. Perfect for an afternoon when he didn't feel like working too hard. The trail began as most do in New England, with a gentle incline through a tunnel of maple and oak trees. Their fallen leaves created a crunchy carpet underfoot, the reds and oranges now fading to brown. Every so often, a white pine would interrupt the deciduous monotony, its long needles forming a soft mat that muted his footsteps. The occasional yellow birch stood out with its peeling, paper-like bark that locals sometimes used to start campfires. About half a mile in, the path crossed a small wooden bridge over a sluggish stream. The planks creaked under his weight, and he paused to look at the dark water below, stained tea-brown from tannins. A few last-of-season ferns clung to the muddy banks, their fronds curling at the edges. Somewhere upstream, a branch snapped, probably a deer, though he didn't see it. The forest here had that quiet stillness unique to weekdays in October, when the leaf peepers had gone home and the hunters hadn't yet arrived in force. The trail curved gently westward, following what might have been an old logging road generations ago. Stone walls peeked through the undergrowth in places, remnants of farms long abandoned to the forest. A rusted piece of machinery, maybe part of a plow, lay half buried in the leaves near one such wall, its purpose no longer obvious. He stepped over a fallen birch trunk covered in shelf fungus, the wood spongy with rot. As the path neared Finnerty Pond, the trees thinned and the air took on the damp, mineral smell of standing water. The pond itself was small and still, its surface reflecting the gray sky like polished slate. A few dead trees stood sentinel in the shallow water, their bleached branches reaching skyward. At the far end, a beaver lodge rose like a messy pile of sticks, though there was no sign of current activity. He sat on a flat rock near the water's edge, the same one he'd used as a lunch spot for years, and took a sip from his water bottle. The only sounds were the occasional plop of a fish rising and the distant caw of a crow. After 15 minutes of not much happening, he got up and continued around the pond. The trail grew muddier here, with boot prints from earlier hikers preserved in the clay-like soil. A boardwalk spanned the wettest section, its planks worn smooth by countless footsteps. Near the halfway point, a spur trail led to an overlook with a view of the Berkshires rolling westward, their autumn colors muted in the afternoon haze. He skipped it today. The view wouldn't have changed since last time. The return leg passed through a stand of hemlocks that blocked most of the sunlight, creating a sudden chill. Their dense canopy meant little grew beneath them, just some moss and the occasional mushroom pushing through the needle carpet. A woodpecker hammered somewhere in the distance, the sound echoing through the trees. The trail joined an old woods road for the final stretch back, wide enough for two to walk abreast if there'd been anyone else around. Back at the parking lot, his car sat alone just as he'd left it. A few more leaves had fallen on the windshield during his walk. He brushed them off before getting in, the vinyl seats cold through his jeans. The engine turned over on the first try, and as he pulled back onto Route 9, the radio automatically tuned to the local station playing classic rock. Another uneventful walk in the woods, exactly as he'd expected. Just another Tuesday afternoon in the Berkshires. The man turned his pickup into the empty parking area just past the Welcome to Vermont sign on Route 100, the gravel crunching under his tires in that particular way it does in late October. A wooden sign with peeling green paint read Moss Glen Falls Trailhead in hand-carved letters, though the falls themselves were barely more than a steep cascade by New England standards. He killed the engine and sat for a moment, listening to the ticking sound of the cooling truck, mixed with the occasional call of a nuthatch from the surrounding maples. The air smelled different here than in Massachusetts. Crisper somehow, with more evergreen in the mix from all the balsam firs that started appearing as soon as you crossed the state line. He grabbed his worn flannel jacket from the back seat and stepped out into the chill, his boots sinking slightly into the damp ground near the trailhead register. The metal box contained a damp notebook where hikers were supposed to sign in, though most pages just had a few scribbled names from peak foliage weekends. He didn't bother adding his. The trail started off wide and well-packed, following an old logging road that gradually narrowed as maples and birches closed in from both sides. Their leaves formed a patchy canopy overhead, letting through shafts of sunlight that illuminated the occasional red trillium berry still clinging to its stalk. The forest floor was a mess of fallen branches and decomposing leaves, with the occasional granite boulder poking through, the kind of rocks that made Vermont's soil so notoriously difficult to farm. About a quarter-mile in, the sound of running water grew louder. The trail split at a wooden post, with arrows pointing left toward the fall's overlook and right toward the gorge trail. He went left, the path now climbing steadily over tree roots and small stones slick with spray from the falls. The air grew damper, carrying that mineral smell of moving water over rock. A few scraggly hemlocks clung to the steep banks, their roots exposed where erosion had undercut the soil. Moss Glen Falls wasn't exactly Niagara, just a series of steep drops totaling maybe 100 feet, the water dividing around a massive glacial erratic at the top before reuniting in the pool below. The viewing area consisted of a few flat rocks and a wooden rail that had seen better days. He sat on one of the drier rocks and watched the water for a while, noting how the afternoon light made the spray glow when it caught the sun just right. A couple of late-season monarch butterflies fluttered near some milkweed pods that hadn't yet burst open, their orange wings looking faded compared to the vibrant maples behind them. After what felt like 20 minutes, he never wore a watch. He retraced his steps to the fork and took the gorge trail downward. This path was rougher, with more exposed roots and sections where runoff had carved deep grooves in the dirt. The sound of the falls faded, replaced by the quieter trickle of smaller streams feeding into the main cascade. A wooden bridge crossed one such stream, its planks worn smooth from years of boot traffic. He paused midway to look at the water below, so clear he could see every pebble on the bottom despite the depth. The gorge walls grew steeper as the trail descended, the rock faces covered in moss and the occasional stubborn fern clinging to cracks. A pileated woodpecker's call echoed from somewhere upstream, that distinctive jungle movie sound that always seemed out of place in New England woods. The trail eventually leveled out near the base of the gorge, where the stream widened into a shallow pool before continuing downhill. A few yellowed skunk cabbage leaves marked what would be a wetland in spring, their foul smell long gone with the season. The loop brought him back to the main trail near the parking area, completing maybe 2 miles total at most. His truck was still the only vehicle there, though someone had left a Dunkin' Donuts cup on the picnic table near the trailhead. He tossed it in the bed of his truck to throw out later. Vermont had a 5-cent bottle deposit after all. The drive back south on Route 100 passed through classic Vermont scenery. Red barns with peeling paint, fields full of round hay bales wrapped in white plastic, the occasional covered bridge looking exactly like it did on the state quarter. He stopped in Rochester for gas and a coffee, the local AM station playing a high school football score update. The coffee tasted like it had been sitting there since morning, which it probably had. Back on the road, with the Green Mountains receding in his rearview mirror, he thought about how little had changed since his last visit. Same falls, same trails, same quiet emptiness that made Vermont feel both timeless and slightly forgotten. The trees might lose their leaves and the snow might come, but Moss Glen would keep flowing just the same, with or without anyone there to notice. He merged onto I-91 South as the sun dipped behind the hills, the truck's heater finally kicking in against the evening chill. Another uneventful afternoon in Vermont, exactly as expected. The man pulled into the half-empty parking lot at Acadia National Park's Jordan Pond entrance just after noon, his tires kicking up small stones from the dirt overflow area. A crisp Maine breeze carried that distinctive coastal pine scent, mixed with something briny from the distant ocean. The late October sun hung pale in the sky, doing little to warm the air that smelled of damp moss and decomposing leaves. He zipped his fleece higher as he stepped out, glancing at the familiar brown park sign with peeling gold letters that listed trail distances and regulations nobody ever read. The path began, as most do in Acadia, wide and gravel-covered, built to handle summer crowds that had long since disappeared. A few stubborn oak leaves clung to branches overhead, their brown edges curling in the salt air, while the blueberry bushes lining the trail had already turned that deep burgundy unique to Maine's coastal autumns. Underfoot, the gravel gave way to the park's signature granite gravel, crushed local stone that sparkled slightly in the weak sunlight. A chipmunk darted across the path, disappearing into a stone wall that had stood since the Civilian Conservation Corps boys built it back in the 1930s. Jordan Pond lay still and dark ahead, its surface rippling slightly from the breeze coming off the nearby ocean. To the left, the trail passed the famous Jordan Pond House, with its empty green lawn chairs still arranged on the sloping lawn. The restaurant closed for the season after the last pop-over tourists had departed weeks earlier. The man kept walking, his boots making hollow sounds on the wooden boardwalk sections that crossed the boggiest areas. The planks, worn smooth by millions of summer sandals, now felt slightly slick with morning dew that never quite burned off this time of year. The loop trail followed the pond's shoreline closely, passing through stands of white pine and pitch pine that blocked most of what little sunlight there was. Their needles formed a dense carpet that muffled footsteps, occasionally giving way to exposed granite ledges where hikers had worn away the thin soil over decades. At the northern end of the pond, the trail climbed slightly over a series of stone steps placed there by park maintenance crews, each one worn concave in the middle from years of use. A weathered sign pointed toward the Bubbles, those two rounded mountains that appeared on every Acadia postcard. But he stayed on the level path, not feeling inclined to climb today. The far side of the pond felt more isolated, the trail narrowing to a single track in places where tree roots created natural steps. A few late-season mushrooms pushed through the pine duff, red-capped ones that might have been poisonous, and the occasional cluster of honey mushrooms that local foragers would have picked months ago. The water here was shallower, and through the clear main water he could see the pond's famous singing sands. Grains of granite so perfectly rounded they supposedly made musical sounds when walked on. Not that anyone would be wading in October. About halfway around, a side trail led to an overlook with a view of the pond and the distant Cranberry Islands. The wooden bench there had initials carved into its arms, JT plus MK09. The letters weathered but still legible after 14 Maine winters. He sat for a while, watching a lone loon dive near the opposite shore, its haunting call echoing across the water in a way that always sounded lonely to him. The wind picked up, carrying the faint diesel smell of a lobster boat working the sound somewhere out of sight. The return leg passed through a section of stunted spruce trees, twisted into strange shapes by coastal winds, their branches all leaning landward as if trying to escape the ocean. A few red squirrels chattered warnings as he passed, their nests of shredded bark visible in the crooks of larger trees. The trail joined an old carriage road near the end, its crushed stone surface still perfectly smooth from decades of Rockefeller money and National Park Service maintenance. A horse-drawn carriage would pass here daily in season, but today the only signs of life were fresh deer tracks in the damp gravel. Back at the parking lot, a few more cars had arrived. Locals, probably, judging by the main plates and lack of roof racks for kayaks. He tossed his half-empty water bottle into the truck's footwell and started the engine. The local NPR affiliate crackling to life with a report on the lobster catch being down this season. As he pulled out onto the Park Loop Road, the afternoon light turned the Cadillac mountain granite a warm, pinkish gray, same as it had every afternoon for millennia. Another quiet walk around Jordan Pond, unchanged since his last visit, and likely to remain so until next spring's tourists returned. He passed through the stone gateposts at the park exit, the ocean now visible between the trees to his right. its surface choppy and dark blue under the October sky. Just another day in coastal Maine, where even the most famous trails felt empty once summer left and the real New England weather set in. "Hey there." The man pulled his truck into the dirt turnout along the Cantimagus Highway, the tires crunching over pine cones and gravel. This stretch of Route 112 through New Hampshire's White Mountains was practically empty now that foliage season had passed. Just a few locals and the occasional trucker using it as a shortcut. He stepped out into air that smelled distinctly of balsam fir and wet granite, that classic White Mountain scent that never seemed to change no matter the decade. The trailhead wasn't much to look at, just a small wooden sign with Greeley Ponds Trail carved into it. The letters faded from years of harsh mountain weather. The parking area had that uneven, frost-heaved pavement common to all Forest Service lots in the region, with weeds growing through every crack. He dropped $5 in the Iron Ranger fee tube, exact change only, the sign reminded hikers, and started down the path, his boots immediately hitting that particular New Hampshire mix of pine needles and granite gravel. The first mile followed an old logging road, wide enough for two but mostly grown over with young spruce and the occasional paper birch. The birches stood out white against the evergreen backdrop, their yellow leaves mostly on the ground now, forming a soggy carpet that squished underfoot in the damp spots. Every so often he'd pass a glacial erratic, those massive boulders the Ice Age glaciers had dropped randomly, some as big as SUVs, all covered in lichen in shades of green and gray. The trail began a gradual climb after crossing a wooden bridge over a stream that was more rock than water this time of year. The bridge's planks were worn smooth from decades of boots, their surface slightly slippery from morning dew. Below, the water ran clear over granite worn smooth by centuries of flow, forming those shallow pools New Englanders called swimming holes, even though nobody would swim in them after Labor Day. A few last-of-season ferns clung to the banks, their fronds turning brown at the edges. About 2 miles in, the forest changed noticeably as the trail entered an area that had burned decades earlier. The regrowth was all skinny spruce and pin cherry trees, their trunks blackened at the base from some long-ago forest fire. The understory opened up here, allowing views of distant peaks like Mount Osceola and East Pond Mountain, not the tallest in the Whites, but steep enough to make your calves burn if you tried climbing them. A pileated woodpecker's call echoed through the burned area, that prehistoric-sounding laugh that always seemed too loud for the surrounding quiet. The first pond appeared suddenly after a short climb, its dark water reflecting the surrounding evergreens perfectly. Greeley Ponds were really just 2 large mountain tarns connected by a shallow stream, the kind of place that would be crowded with hikers in July, but was deserted now. He sat on a flat rock near the water's edge, the granite cold even through his pants. The only sounds were the occasional plop of a fish rising and the distant rush of wind through the higher peaks. A few late-season mosquitoes hovered, but didn't bite. It was too cold for them now, thankfully. After eating the peanut butter sandwich he'd brought, he continued around the larger pond's shoreline. The trail grew rougher here, with more roots and rocks to navigate. In places, wooden bog bridges crossed the wettest sections, their surfaces worn smooth and slightly mossy. A spur path led to an overlook with a view of the smaller pond below, its surface ruffled by the same breeze that made the surrounding spruce trees sway slightly. The overlook's wooden rail was carved with decades of initials and dates, the oldest still legible being RD 1972. The return trip followed the same path back, which was fine by him. He'd never been one for loop hikes anyway. The burned area looked different in afternoon light, the shadows longer now that the sun was dipping toward the western peaks. Back at the stream crossing, he paused to watch the water for a while, noting how it swirled around certain rocks in patterns that probably hadn't changed in centuries. A red squirrel chattered angrily from a nearby spruce, upset at the human intrusion. The parking lot was still nearly empty when he returned. Just one other car now, an old Subaru with New Hampshire plates, and a "This car climbed Mount Washington" sticker on the bumper. He tossed his pack in the truck bed and sat for a moment with the door open, listening to the distant sound of a chainsaw from somewhere down the valley. The Kancamagus stretched out before him, its empty pavement winding through the mountains exactly as it had when he'd first driven it 20 years earlier. Some things in the whites never changed, and he figured that was probably for the best. The engine turned over with that familiar rumble, and as he pulled back onto the highway, the local AM station crackled to life with a weather report warning of frost overnight. Just another quiet day in the White Mountains, where the trails stayed the same, and the only real excitement was whether you'd need a heavier jacket tomorrow. The man pulled off Route 302 into the nearly empty Crawford Notch State Park lot, his tires rolling over the familiar mix of gravel and decomposing leaves that seemed to cover every parking area in northern New Hampshire. The air smelled different here in the Notch, colder and sharper, with that distinct alpine edge you only get when surrounded by 4,000-foot peaks on all sides. He grabbed his worn flannel jacket from behind the seat, the one with the torn pocket he kept meaning to sew, and stepped out into air so still he could hear a single yellow birch leaf skitter across the pavement. The trailhead wasn't much to look at. Just a simple wooden sign with Ripley Falls burned into the wood in uneven letters, the arrow pointing toward what looked like an ordinary woods road. The parking fee was $4, exact change only, so he dropped the wrinkled bills into the iron pipe bolted to the kiosk. The register notebook inside the metal box showed only 3 other hikers this week, their names barely legible in smudged pencil. He didn't bother signing in. The path started as most do in the whites, wide and gravel-covered at first, following what had clearly been an old logging road decades earlier. The surrounding forest was that particular White Mountain mix of beech, yellow birch, and spruce, their branches still dripping from yesterday's rain. Every so often, a massive glacial erratic would appear beside the trail, some as big as pickup trucks, all covered in that fuzzy green lichen that grows on everything in damp New England. The ground was littered with beech nuts, their spiky outer casings crunching underfoot like some natural version of bubble wrap. After about half a mile of gentle incline, the trail narrowed and began following a small stream uphill. The sound of running water grew louder as the path became rockier, with occasional stone steps placed there by trail crews long ago. The steps were worn smooth in the centers, their edges rounded by decades of boot traffic and winter freeze-thaw cycles. A wooden bridge crossed the stream at one point, its planks slightly springy underfoot, the railings polished shiny by countless hands gripping them over the years. The falls appeared suddenly around a bend in the trail, not some towering cascade, but a steep, sliding drop of about 100 feet over smooth granite. The water fanned out in thin sheets over the rock, creating that distinctive veil look that gave Ripley Falls its reputation as one of the prettier waterfalls in the Whites. The spray zone was marked by a distinct change in vegetation. Suddenly there were more ferns and mosses, their greens impossibly vibrant against the gray rock. A single gnarled spruce clung to a crack in the cliff face, its roots exposed where centuries of water had eroded the soil beneath it. He sat on one of the flat rocks near the base of the falls, the stone cold even through his pants. The mist from the falling water kept the air chilly, carrying that mineral smell unique to mountain streams. A few late-season goldenrod plants clung to life in sheltered cracks, their yellow flowers looking oddly bright against all the gray and green. Somewhere upstream, a branch snapped, probably a deer, though he didn't bother looking up to check. After a while, he never wore a watch. He started back down the trail. The return hike was always quicker, the slight downhill grade making his knees remember they weren't as young as they used to be. The same glacial erratics passed by in reverse order, the same beech nuts crunched underfoot. Near the trailhead, he passed an older couple heading up, the first people he'd seen all day. They nodded silently, the standard White Mountain greeting between hikers, and continued on their way without speaking. Back at the parking lot, his truck was still the only vehicle there. He tossed his jacket onto the passenger seat and started the engine. The local AM station crackling to life with a weather report about frost warnings for the higher elevations. As he pulled back onto Route 302, the afternoon sun lit up the cliffs of Crawford Notch in that particular way it only does in late October, all golden light and long shadows. The Willie House historic site passed by on the right, its empty parking lot and closed visitor center looking abandoned until next tourist season. Another few miles down the road, the iconic Mount Washington Hotel appeared in the distance, its white facade and red roofs looking exactly as they had for a century, framed by the changing leaves of the surrounding hardwoods. He turned up the heat as the notch's microclimate made the temperature drop noticeably, his breath briefly fogging the windshield until the defroster caught up. The truck's engine hummed steadily as the highway began its gradual descent toward Bartlett and the Mount Washington Valley beyond. Another quiet hike completed, another waterfall checked off the mental list. Another afternoon in the Whites where nothing much happened, and that was exactly how he liked it. The mountains would still be there next week, next month, next year, unchanged, except for the seasons cycling through their endless rotations. And he'd be back too, probably, to walk another trail and see another stream, because that's just what people did in these parts when they needed to remember how little things really changed in the grand scheme of things. The man turned around and started walking back the same way he came, his boots scuffing against the worn dirt path that countless hikers had trodden before him. The trail was just as quiet as before, with only the sound of dry leaves crunching underfoot breaking the silence. The air still carried that familiar New England autumn smell, a mix of pine resin, damp earth, and something faintly sweet from the decaying maple leaves. The trees here were mostly sugar maples and red oaks, their leaves showing off those classic New England colors. Bright red, deep orange, and golden yellow, with some already turned brown and papery, littering the ground in uneven patches. A few white pines stood like sentinels among the deciduous trees, their needles staying stubbornly green throughout the seasons. Every now and then, a yellow birch would appear among them, its distinctive peeling bark curling in thin, papery strips that fluttered slightly in the occasional breeze. He passed the same old glacial erratic he'd noticed earlier, a massive granite boulder about the size of a pickup truck, covered in patches of moss and lichen. It was one of those rocks that glaciers had dragged down from Canada during the last ice age and then abandoned when they melted, now serving as a permanent fixture in the New England woods. The surface was pitted and weathered, with shallow depressions that sometimes held rainwater. A little farther down the trail, there was a small wooden sign nailed to a mature oak tree, the kind put up by the local Appalachian Mountain Club chapter, with the words, "Appalachian Trail, 50 miles," burned into the wood in uneven letters. Not that he was planning to walk that far today. He just wanted to get back to his car before the early New England dusk settled in. The sign had faded to a silvery gray over the years, its edges worn smooth by weather and occasional passing hands. Someone had carved their initials into it at some point. JR98. But time had made the letters shallow and barely legible. The path was easy enough to follow, packed hard by generations of boots and maintained by volunteers from the local Trails Association. Every now and then, a gray squirrel would dart across the trail, its claws scratching against bark as it raced up a nearby tree. The wind picked up slightly, making the bare upper branches of younger trees rub together with a creaking sound. Somewhere in the distance, probably near that small wetland area marked on the trail map, a blue jay let out its harsh, scolding call, the sound carrying clearly through the crisp autumn air before the forest returned to its usual quiet. A few late-season crickets chirped half-heartedly in the underbrush, where sunlight still reached the forest floor, their rhythm slow and uneven, as if they couldn't quite decide whether it was still summer or already fall. He passed all the familiar landmarks, the young birch tree that grew at an odd angle after some long-ago storm, the patch of interrupted ferns that had turned a sickly yellow before other plants, the massive granite ledge that local kids probably used as a climbing spot in summer. Nothing remarkable, just the usual assortment of natural features you'd find in any Massachusetts woodland. The trail made its lazy curve to the left, following what had once been a deer path or maybe an old logging road, gradually leading him back toward the small parking area near the historic covered bridge. The bridge was one of those classic New England tourist spots, the kind that showed up on fall foliage calendars and local history brochures. Built in 1887 according to the faded plaque on its side, the red paint was peeling in places where moisture had gotten underneath, and the wooden beams inside smelled like generations of damp wool and tobacco smoke. Not that he paid much attention to it. He'd seen it dozens of times before, and right now he was more concerned with getting home before dark. The light was definitely fading now, the sky shifting from pale blue to that particular flat gray that comes before twilight in autumn. The temperature dropped noticeably as the sun dipped lower, and he zipped up his fleece jacket all the way, shoving his hands in his pockets. His footsteps sounded heavier now on the packed earth, the rhythm steady and monotonous. The forest scenery didn't change much. Same mix of trees, same carpet of leaves, same quiet atmosphere. A few more fallen branches lay across the path than there had been on his way in, probably brought down by recent winds. But they were easy enough to step over. Somewhere off to the right, probably in that stand of dead hemlocks, a pileated woodpecker hammered at a trunk, the sound echoing through the woods like someone knocking on hollow wood. After about 30 seconds of intermittent drilling, it stopped, leaving only the occasional whisper of leaves moving in the breeze. Eventually, the trail began its final gentle descent, and he could see the split-rail fence that marked the boundary of the state forest land. The fence had that weathered gray look that all untreated New England wood eventually gets. The posts leaning slightly where frost heaves had shifted the ground over winters past. 20 more paces, and he emerged from the tree line into the small gravel parking area. His car, an old Subaru Outback with a dented rear bumper from that time he slid into a snowbank last winter, sat alone in the lot, its dark green paint nearly blending in with the surrounding pines. The gravel crunched loudly under his boots as he crossed the empty lot, the sound somehow louder than anything he'd heard in the woods. He fished the keys from his pocket, the metal jingling against the worn leather keychain he'd gotten at a gas station years ago. The car door opened with its usual creak, the interior smelling faintly of old coffee and wet dog. Nothing had happened on his walk. Nothing ever did. And that was perfectly fine with him. He turned the key, the engine rumbling to life, and pulled out of the lot, leaving the forest exactly as he'd found it. Quiet, unchanged, and patiently waiting for the next hiker to come along. Hey there. The man pulled into the deserted parking area off Route 113 near Evans Notch, the tires of his pickup crunching over a thick layer of beech nuts that had fallen from the surrounding trees. This stretch along the Maine New Hampshire border was always quiet after Columbus Day, when the leaf peepers had all gone home and the ski crowds hadn't yet arrived. He stepped out into air that smelled distinctly different from the other notches. Less alpine, more like damp leaves and the faintest hint of wood smoke from some distant hunting camp. The trailhead kiosk had seen better days, its plexiglass cover scratched and fogged with age, the map underneath barely legible. A metal sign announced this as the Brickett Place Trailhead in faded green letters, with smaller print noting it was part of the White Mountain National Forest. The old farmhouse that gave the area its name stood off to the side, its white paint peeling. The Historical Society plaque on the front nearly unreadable from years of weathering. He dropped $3 in the honor system fee tube, exact change only, though nobody would likely check this late in the season. The path started as an old woods road, wide enough for a tractor, but now mostly grown in with young maples and the occasional striped maple. their distinctive vertical bark patterns standing out in the afternoon light. The ground was carpeted with fallen beech leaves, their copper color fading to brown, the dry ones crunching underfoot, while the damp ones just compressed silently. Every so often, a massive glacial erratic appeared beside the trail, some as big as small houses, all covered in that fuzzy green lichen that seems to grow on every stationary surface in northern New England. After about a mile, the trail began following Cold Brook, the sound of running water growing louder as the path narrowed and became rockier. The brook itself was low this time of year, revealing shelves of granite that would be underwater in spring, their surfaces worn smooth by centuries of flowing water. A few stubborn ferns still clung to life in sheltered cracks, their fronds turning yellow at the edges. The wooden bridge across the brook's widest point creaked under his weight, its planks worn smooth by decades of boots, and its railings polished shiny from countless hands. The trail climbed gradually through a stand of hemlocks that blocked most of the sunlight, creating a sudden temperature drop. Their needles formed a dense carpet that muffled all sound, except the occasional chatter of a red squirrel. A spur path led to an overlook with a view of the Bald Faces, those distinctive bare-topped mountains that were popular with hikers in summer but deserted now. He skipped the detour today. The view would be the same as last time, just with fewer leaves on the trees. The main trail continued along the brook before opening up into what had clearly been pasture land a century earlier. The old stone walls were still visible beneath the young forest growth, their lines straighter than anything nature would create. A few apple trees stood gnarled and untended near one such wall, their small, bitter fruit long since fallen and mostly eaten by deer. The path grew muddier here where springs surfaced, the wooden bog bridges slick with algae and slightly springy underfoot. At the turnaround point, a small waterfall that was more of a steep cascade, really. He sat on one of the flat rocks and ate the peanut butter sandwich he'd brought. The water made a constant white noise as it tumbled over the granite ledges, the kind of sound that eventually fades into the background until you notice it again. A few late-season mosquitoes hovered but didn't land. It was too cold for them now. The rock was cold through his pants, but he stayed a while anyway, watching the water patterns that never repeated exactly the same way twice. The hike back was the same in reverse, just slightly downhill. The same glacial erratics passed by in opposite order, the same stone walls, the same section of trail where his boots sank slightly into the damp earth. Near the trailhead, he passed a lone hiker heading in, the first person he'd seen all day. They exchanged nods, the standard greeting in these parts, and continued on their separate ways without speaking. Back at the parking lot, his truck was still the only vehicle there. He tossed his pack in the bed and sat for a moment with the door open, listening to the distant sound of a woodpecker hammering somewhere up the valley. The late afternoon light slanted through the beech trees, their smooth gray trunks standing in sharp contrast to the darker hemlocks behind them. As he started the engine, the local AM station came to life with a weather report warning of possible snow flurries above 3,000 feet overnight. He turned onto Route 113, passing the empty campgrounds and shuttered ranger station that marked this as the true off-season in Evans Notch. Another quiet hike completed. Another trail walked without incident or excitement, just the way he preferred it. The mountains would still be here next week, next month, next year. Same trails, same rocks, same brooks running endlessly downhill. And he'd probably be back too, when the need for quiet and routine outweighed the appeal of staying home. Because that's just what people did in these parts. Year after year, season after season. Hi guys, let's talk about where regular folks slept in England back in the Middle Ages, say around the 1300s or 1400s. It wasn't like today. Most people didn't have separate rooms just for sleeping. Instead, almost everything happened in one main room. This was the main space in their house. The house was usually pretty small and not fancy at all. Many houses were built using a method called half-timbering. That means the frame was made of wood beams you could see, and the spaces in between were filled with a mix of woven sticks and mud or clay, which they called wattle and daub. The roof was often covered in thatch. Thatch is just dried reeds or straw bundled together tightly. It was common stuff. Houses like this were everywhere, in little villages scattered across the countryside. Places maybe a day's walk from something big like Stonehenge, though people then probably just thought of those stones as some old rocks. Not a big deal. You'd find them inside old walled towns too, like within the walls of York or London, squeezed close together. This one main room was where life happened during the day. People cooked their meals over a fire in a fireplace built into the wall, called a hearth. The hearth was important because it gave heat and light. They ate their food in this room. They fixed their tools, or maybe did some weaving here. Kids played on the floor if it wasn't too crowded. Animals might sometimes be brought inside if it was very cold, especially in smaller farmhouses. It was a busy place when the sun was up. When it got dark, which happened early, especially in winter, things changed. Without good lights, maybe just a dim rushlight, a reed soaked in fat, or the glow from the hearth's embers, doing much was hard. So people went to sleep. And guess what? They slept right there in that same main room where they did everything else. Everyone slept together in this space. The whole family. That meant mom and dad, all the kids, maybe a grandma or grandpa if they lived there, and sometimes even a servant or a farm worker if the family had one. Privacy, like having your own bedroom, wasn't something most people thought about or could afford. They all just bedded down together on the floor of the living space. It was normal. Imagine a family of 6 or 8 people, maybe more, all settling down for the night in one room that also smelled a bit like the dinner they cooked and the smoke from the fire. The air could get pretty thick, especially since chimneys weren't always great at letting all the smoke out. The walls might be damp sometimes because of the English weather, which is often rainy. So where did they actually sleep? Well, it wasn't usually on a raised bed with a mattress like we know it. Those cost money and took up space. For most regular people, the floor was the sleeping spot. But they didn't just lie down on the hard, packed earth or stone floor directly. That would be cold and uncomfortable. Instead, they spread out a layer of straw or dried rushes all over the floor where they slept. Rushes are like tough grasses that grow near water. Sometimes, if they were doing a bit better, they might have a rough cloth sack or a big bag stuffed with straw or dry leaves. This sack was their mattress. People called this kind of bedding a straw pallet, or just the straw. After the harvest time, the straw might be newer and fresher. Other times, especially later in the winter, it might be old, broken down, and kind of dusty or crumbly. They didn't change it super often. They'd just sweep out the worst of it and add new straw on top sometimes, or replace a big bunch when it got too lumpy or smelly. That was about as comfortable as sleeping got for most folks in that one room. Nobody expected fancy beds. The fire in the hearth would slowly die down to just glowing embers as the night went on. The room would get colder. It would get very dark, except for maybe the faintest red glow from the hearth or the tiny flickering light of a rushlight if someone had bothered to light one, which they often didn't to save the fat. Everyone would huddle down on their bit of the straw. They might pull rough wool blankets over themselves, or just use their outer clothes or cloaks as covers. People back then wore more layers of simple wool clothes day and night anyway. Then, they would try to sleep until the morning light came through the small, often unglazed windows, covered maybe with oiled cloth or a wooden shutter, or until something woke them up. A baby crying, someone snoring, the cold, animals outside, or needing to use the outdoor toilet area, which was just a pit or a ditch somewhere away from the house. It wasn't complicated. One room, one space for cooking, eating, working, and sleeping. One shared pile of straw on the floor. That was the normal, everyday setup for a huge number of people living in England during those centuries. Whether you lived in a tiny hamlet near the old stones of Stonehenge on Salisbury Plain, or in a cramped lane within sight of the huge York Minster Cathedral, or along the Thames near London Bridge, if you were an ordinary person, this single-room living and sleeping was likely your reality. The big churches or castles were places you saw, maybe even worked on, but they weren't where you slept. You slept on the straw on the floor in your one room. When morning came, you got up, stirred the fire, and started the day right there again. It was simple, crowded, and just how things were done back then. People didn't know anything different, so they didn't complain much about it. It was normal life. The sounds of the night were the sounds of your family breathing. Maybe the wind whistling through gaps in the wattle and daub, or an animal outside, and the crackle of the dying fire. Then morning came, and it was time to get up and work. Usually starting by getting the fire going again in the same hearth right there in the same room where everyone had just been sleeping. The straw might be kicked aside a bit or left there until later. There wasn't a big routine of making beds like today. You just got up and started the day. The room switched from sleeping space back to living space pretty quickly. The smell of smoke and maybe cooking would replace the quiet smells of the night. It was all the same place. That's how it was for most folks sleeping in medieval England. Not much changed day to day. It was just life in that one room, on the straw. Simple, crowded, normal. Nothing exciting to report, really. Just people trying to rest in the space they had, using what they had, which wasn't much beyond the basics. The big famous places like the Tower of London or Canterbury Cathedral were far away from the daily reality of sleeping on a straw pallet in a smoky, single-room house in a village or a crowded town street. Those landmarks existed, but they didn't change how ordinary people slept. They slept on the floor, together, in the main room. That's the main point. Day in, day out, for generations. The straw got replaced sometimes. The people grew up and had kids who also slept on the straw. The thatch roof needed fixing now and then. The wattle and daub might need patching after heavy English rain. But the way of sleeping, in that one room together, stayed pretty much the same for a long, long time. It was just the way it was done. Nothing fancy. Nothing complicated. Just sleep where you live, with everyone else. End of story for how most people slept in medieval England. At least that's the first part about where they slept. It wasn't special. It was normal life back then. The room was small. The air was smoky sometimes. The straw got old, but it was home, and it was where they slept. Every night, in England, during the Middle Ages, in houses made of wood and mud and straw, under thatch roofs, near places we now think of as important, but which were just part of the landscape to them, like Stonehenge, or the big walls around York, or the river in London, just places, while they slept on straw on the floor in their one room. That's it. That's how it was for sleeping for most people. Simple and straightforward, no extra frills, just the basics. Sleep, get up, work, sleep again, in the same space, with everyone, on the straw, night after night, year after year, in medieval England. Okay, that covers the place. It was just the main room. One room for everything, including sleep, for almost everyone who wasn't rich, which was most people. So most people slept like this, on the floor, on straw, together, in England. Back then, the end of this part. Morning would come, and they'd start over. But that's not part of the sleeping part. That's later. For now, they were asleep, on the straw, in the room, together, in medieval England. That's the first thing about how they slept. Where? It was the main room. All right. Let's move on from where people slept to what they actually slept on back in medieval England, especially around places like London or Canterbury. For most regular folks, the fancy beds you might picture weren't really part of their lives. Forget mattresses stuffed with feathers or springs. What people used was much simpler and, honestly, pretty basic. Think about that main room we talked about last time. The floor was often just packed earth. Maybe some stone if you were in a slightly better house in a town like York near the old walls, or near the Thames in London. Lying straight on that hard surface all night. Not comfortable, not warm. So people put down a layer of stuff. The most common thing was straw. Dry straw, spread out in a thickish layer in the corner or along the wall where the family slept. Sometimes it was dried rushes, which are like tough grasses you find near rivers, maybe even gathered down by the Fleet Ditch in London before it got really bad. This stuff was cheap and available, especially after the harvest. Farmers had plenty. They called this bedding a pallet, or just the straw. It wasn't fancy. After a while, the straw would get broken down, dusty, and probably itchy. It might start to smell, especially if the room was damp from the English rain, or if small critters found it cozy. People didn't change it every day. Maybe they'd sweep out the worst bits sometimes and throw down some fresh straw on top, or replace a big chunk of it when it got too gross or lumpy. Comfort wasn't the main goal. It was about having something between you and the cold, hard floor. For slightly better off families, maybe a craftsman living near the shambles in York or a shopkeeper on a London lane, they might have a rough sack made of cheap cloth. like hemp or coarse linen. They'd stuff this sack with straw, dried leaves, or maybe even dried ferns or moss gathered from the woods. This was a step up from just loose straw on the floor. It was called a straw tick, or a mattress, but it was still pretty lumpy and scratchy. You'd toss this stuffed sack onto the straw layer, or sometimes onto a simple wooden frame if they had one. A basic platform off the ground, maybe just a foot high. This kept you a tiny bit further from drafts and dirt on the floor. But mostly, it was still straw inside. Wool was a big deal in England back then. Sheep were everywhere, so sometimes if a family had a bit more, they might have a thin mattress stuffed with wool clippings or waste wool. This was definitely softer and warmer than straw, but it was still nothing like a modern mattress. It could get lumpy and compacted over time. Even these wool mattresses weren't super common for average folks. Straw was king. What did they cover up with? Blankets were usually made of wool, too. Rough, scratchy wool blankets. They weren't thick and fluffy like we have now. They were woven simply and were pretty heavy and stiff, especially when they got damp in the humid English air. Sometimes people just used their heavy outer cloaks or extra layers of their regular wool clothing as covers. Rich folks had fur covers or finer woolen blankets, maybe even linen sheets. But for the person living in a small house near Canterbury Cathedral or walking past the Tower of London every day, thick, scratchy wool was the nighttime standard. Pillows? Mostly not a thing. Seriously. The idea of a soft pillow for your head wasn't universal. Many people, especially the less well-off, just bundled up a piece of their clothing, like a tunic or a cloak, and used that to rest their head on. Maybe they had a small sack stuffed with straw or husks. Real pillows stuffed with feathers or down were a luxury item, mostly for the wealthy or perhaps seen by common folks inside the grand churches, like Westminster Abbey during services, but not in their own homes at night. You made do with what you had, which often meant resting your head on your arm or a rolled-up piece of cloth. So picture it. In a dim, smoky room in a half-timbered house somewhere in England, maybe hearing the bells from St. Paul's in London or smelling the River Ouse in York, a family settles down for the night. They lie down on a crackling layer of old straw, or maybe on a scratchy sack filled with more straw. They pull rough, heavy wool blankets over themselves. Their heads rest on a folded tunic. The air might be chilly and damp. The straw rustles. It might itch. It wasn't soft. It wasn't what we'd call comfortable, but it was what most people had. It was their bed. Night after night, year after year. The straw got replaced eventually. The blankets wore thin, but the basics stayed pretty much the same. Straw for padding, wool for warmth, the floor or a simple platform, and whatever was handy for your head. That was sleeping comfort for the average person in medieval England. No frills, just the simplest way to get off the cold ground and try to get some rest before another long day of work in the fields, or a shop, or down by the docks on the Thames. It was functional, not fancy. And that's pretty much all there was to it for a huge number of people living back then. The big castles and cathedrals stood tall, but inside the small homes, sleep happened on scratchy, simple bedding made from whatever was cheap and available locally. Straw from the fields, wool from the sheep, simple cloth. That was the recipe for a medieval English bed for the common man, woman, and child. Nothing exciting to report, really. just the way it was. They didn't know any different, so they didn't complain much. It was just part of life, sleeping on scratchy straw under scratchy wool, in a room that smelled like smoke and damp earth, somewhere in England during those centuries. Okay, that covers what they slept on. Next time, maybe where the slightly richer folks slept. But for now, that's the straw and wool reality for most. The end of this part about bedding. Let's talk about what they actually wore when they slept back in medieval England, say around the 1300s or 1400s. The simple answer is that most regular folks didn't really have special clothes just for sleeping. Not like pajamas or nightgowns we might think of today. For the average person living in a small village near a place like Canterbury Cathedral or in a crowded lane not far from the old London Wall, nighttime clothing was usually just their daytime clothing, maybe with some adjustments. It was a practical thing. People back then wore layers of simple clothes made mostly from wool. Wool was everywhere because England had a lot of sheep. It was the main fabric. Linen was used too, especially for the layer right next to the skin, like an undershirt. But wool was king for warmth, even when it got damp from the frequent English rain or fog rolling in off the Thames or the Ouse in York. A man might typically wear a long shirt called a tunic, some simple trousers or leggings made from wool or rough cloth, and perhaps a heavier woolen cloak or outer coat for colder days. Women wore long dresses or tunics, often with an overdress on top, and maybe a head covering like a wimple or a simple kerchief to keep their hair tidy and their head a bit warmer. When it was time to sleep in that one main room everyone shared, people wouldn't usually get completely undressed. There were a few reasons for this. First, it was often cold, especially in winter. The fire in the hearth would die down to embers, and drafts came through the gaps in the wattle and daub walls under the door, or through the oiled cloth covering window holes. Places like the Cotswolds or up near York could get pretty chilly at night. Second, getting undressed completely wasn't always practical or considered necessary. Privacy was very limited, with everyone sleeping together in the same room. Parents, kids, maybe grandparents or a servant. Changing clothes fully just wasn't something done much at night. Third, it was faster and easier. So what most people did was take off their outer layers. They might remove their shoes, if they had any beyond simple leather wraps or wooden pattens for muddy streets. They might take off their belt, and perhaps their heavy outer wool tunic or overdress. But the basic underlayer, like the long shirt or smock, usually stayed on. This long shirt, often made of linen or coarse wool, was essentially their underwear and also their base layer for sleeping. It wasn't special sleepwear. It was just the clothes they had on under everything else. Sometimes, if it wasn't too cold, maybe on a rare warm summer night down near the coast in Sussex or Kent, they might take off their outer wool tunic or dress and just sleep in that long undershirt or smock. But very often, especially in the colder months, which were most of the year in England, they would sleep in most of their day clothes. They might pull their wool cloak over themselves like an extra blanket, or use a rough sackcloth covering. The main idea was to stay warm enough to sleep, not to be comfortable in fancy sleep clothes. Comfort wasn't really the big goal. Survival, avoiding freezing, and getting some basic rest were the priorities. So you'd see folks bedding down on their straw pallet, wearing their wool leggings and their tunic, or their wool dress, maybe loosened a bit at the neck or waist, but still very much on. Their head covering, like the kerchief or coif, might stay on too, for extra warmth on their head and ears in the drafty room. Even their stockings or hose might stay on their feet. For little kids, it was much the same. They wore smaller versions of adult clothes, simple tunics or smocks made from whatever fabric was available, often hand-me-downs or rough homespun wool. They usually slept in these clothes too. Babies might be swaddled tightly in long linen strips, which was a common practice people thought helped them grow straight and kept them warm and secure, preventing them from startling themselves awake. Then the swaddled baby would be placed near their mother on the straw for warmth and feeding during the night. Now, for the folks who were a bit better off, maybe a merchant living near the Guildhall in London, or a minor landowner in a village within sight of York Minster, or the walls of Chester. Things might be slightly different. They might afford a separate sleeping space, even if it was just a corner curtained off in a larger room. They might have access to finer, softer linen for their undergarments. They might have a specific, looser shirt or a simple gown made of linen that they wore only for sleeping. But even for these slightly richer people, it wasn't usually a radically different outfit bought just for bed. It was often just a cleaner, perhaps longer or less worn-out version of their basic undertunic. Not something you'd find in a special store called sleepwear. They still relied on layers and heavy wool blankets for warmth. The very wealthy, like lords living in castles like Windsor or Warwick, or bishops in palaces near cathedrals like Lincoln or Durham, definitely had proper nightshirts and maybe even robes, often made from finer linen or even imported silk. These might be seen by servants or glimpsed during rare visits, but that world of silk nightwear was completely separate from the reality of the common person living near the Thames docks in Southwark or farming near Stonehenge on Salisbury Plain. Their scratchy wool was the nighttime standard. A big reason for sleeping in day clothes was simple practicality. Getting fully dressed in the dark, cold morning, especially in a single room with only the faintest gray light coming through an oiled cloth window or a crack in the shutters, was difficult and time-consuming. Candles or rushlights cost money. If you were already wearing most of your clothes, your smock, your tunic, your leggings, you could just get up, pull on your outer tunic or dress over it, fasten your belt, slip on your shoes or pattens, and start your day much quicker. This was important when your day started before dawn. Also, clothes weren't washed very often. Water had to be hauled, heated over the fire, and washing took time and effort. Wool, especially the thick outer layers, wasn't easy to clean frequently and could shrink or felt. Linen undershirts might be washed more, but still not daily. So wearing them day and night wasn't seen as particularly strange or overly dirty by the standards of the time. Lice and fleas were common facts of life for everyone, rich or poor, sleeping in fine feather beds in castles like the Tower of London, or on straw in a hut near Runnymede, partly because of the infrequent washing of bodies and clothes. The scratchiness of the wool was just part of life. So picture a family settling down for the night in their half-timbered house somewhere in England. The bells from the local parish church, maybe saint. Mary Le Beau in London, or a smaller, simpler church in a village near Hadrian's Wall, have rung for curfew, signaling it's time to be indoors. The room is dark, except for the faint red glow from the hearth's embers. They kick off their rough leather shoes, or set aside their wooden pattens near the door. Dad takes off his belt and his heavy outer wool tunic, folding it roughly or just dropping it nearby. He sleeps in his woolen leggings and his long linen shirt. Mom might loosen the laces or ties on her wool dress, but keeps it on over her smock, perhaps keeping her head kerchief tied for warmth. The older kids curl up in their smaller tunics and leggings. The younger ones might just be in their smocks. They pull the scratchy, heavy wool blankets over themselves. No one changes into special, soft pajamas. The clothes they worked in the fields near Glastonbury Tor, or sold goods in a stall near London Bridge, or mended nets by the coast, are the same clothes they sleep in. It was just simpler, warmer, saved time, and was more practical given the lack of privacy and the cold. And that was pretty much it for sleepwear for most people across England during those centuries. Nothing fancy, nothing special. Just the same basic layers they wore during the day, slightly adjusted for lying down. It got the job done. They didn't lie awake wishing for cotton pajamas. They just slept in what they had on. If they woke up cold in the middle of the night, shivering in the damp air common near places like the Fens or the Lake District, they'd pull the rough blanket tighter or huddle closer to a family member or the dying warmth of the hearth. The wool clothes provided some barrier against the chill, even if they were scratchy and smelled of wood smoke and daily toil. Morning would come, gray light slowly filtering through the oiled cloth covering the window hole, and they'd stand up, pull on their outer tunic or dress over the slept-in underlayer, fasten their belt, slip on their shoes, and the clothes they slept in became the clothes they worked in again. Day in, day out. The linen smock or shirt might get changed eventually, when it was deemed necessary, or perhaps on a Sunday before church near a place like Salisbury Cathedral. But the wool layers? They were worn and slept in repeatedly, week after week. It was just how things were done. No big deal. No special routines or fancy garments. Sleep, get up, work, sleep again, mostly in the same clothes. Simple, practical. Not too comfortable by modern standards, but completely normal and unremarkable for the time in England. The big churches stood tall, casting shadows. The castles loomed on hills over towns. But inside the countless small homes, people slept in their work clothes. That's the unexciting reality for sleepwear back then. Nothing too complicated about it. Just people using what they had, day and night. Okay, that covers what they wore to bed. Or rather, what they didn't change out of for bed. End of this part about nighttime clothes. Let's talk about where the richer folks slept back in medieval England. This means people like lords living in castles, well-off merchants in towns like London or York, maybe some higher-up church people near places like Canterbury Cathedral or Westminster Abbey. Their sleeping situation was definitely different from the common folks in their one smoky room. It wasn't all super fancy like in movies, but it was a step up. First off, these people usually had a separate room just for sleeping. It wasn't always huge, but it was their own space, away from the main hall or the kitchen. In a big stone castle, like Windsor Castle or Warwick Castle, The lord and lady might have a private chamber, often called a solar. This room was usually up high in a tower or off the main hall, maybe overlooking the castle courtyard or the Thames River if it was near water. It offered some quiet and privacy. In a townhouse belonging to a successful merchant near the Guildhall in London or the Shambles in York, the master and mistress of the house would likely have their own bedchamber on an upper floor, away from the shop or the servants below. Even hearing the bells from St. Paul's or York Minster felt a bit different when you were in your own room. Inside this room, the main thing was the bed. It wasn't a mattress on the floor. It was a proper wooden bed frame. These frames were often big and heavy, made from strong English oak. They were raised quite high off the floor, sometimes needing steps to get into them. This kept them away from drafts and dirt. The frame held ropes stretched tightly across it, forming a sort of base. On top of these ropes, they placed a mattress. But this mattress wasn't stuffed with straw like the common folks used. It was stuffed with softer things. Goose or duck feathers were the best, making it soft and warm. Sometimes they used wool, but a much finer, cleaner wool than the scratchy blankets others used. This feather bed was a big sign of being rich. Around this bed, there were often curtains, heavy cloth hangings, maybe made of wool or even velvet for the very rich, hung from the bed frame or from a special frame around the bed, called a canopy. These curtains could be pulled shut all the way around the bed. This did a few things. First, it kept out drafts, which was important in cold stone castles or drafty townhouses, especially during damp English winters near places like the Fens or the Lake District. Second, it gave privacy, especially if servants came into the room. Third, it kept out insects, though bugs were still a problem everywhere. The curtains might have fancy patterns or even pictures woven into them. Closing yourself into this little cloth room at night was pretty much the height of comfort back then. The bedding itself was also better. Instead of rough wool blankets, they had sheets made of linen. Linen was smoother and felt nicer against the skin than scratchy wool. Then, on top of the sheets, they had blankets, but again, finer wool ones, maybe even woven in places like the Cotswolds known for good wool. And then, for extra warmth or show, they might have a coverlet. This could be a brightly colored woven blanket, or even one stuffed with feathers, like a big quilt. Pillows were a thing here too. They weren't sacks of straw. They were stuffed with feathers, soft and comfortable for your head. They might have pillowcases made of linen too. The room itself might have a few other things. Maybe a chest for storing clothes and valuables, often locked. Perhaps a small table and a stool. There might be a fireplace to keep the room warm, which was a huge luxury. A fireplace meant you didn't have to rely on the main hall fire downstairs. A servant would come in to tend it. Windows might have shutters to keep out the cold and dark, and sometimes even panes of glass, which was incredibly expensive and rare. Mostly, it was just shutters or maybe oiled cloth. If you were a bishop living near Durham Cathedral, you might have slightly nicer glass. Rushes or straw were still sometimes strewn on the floor, but it was cleaner straw, changed more often, and maybe even sprinkled with herbs to smell nicer. But it was still straw on the floor. Life wasn't perfectly quiet, though. Even in a private chamber in the Tower of London, you might hear guards changing watch, horses in the courtyard, or the general noise of the city or castle outside. But it was definitely quieter than sleeping in the main hall with dozens of people. Getting ready for bed might involve a servant bringing warm water to wash your face and hands. You might change into a special nightshirt, a long linen garment, instead of sleeping in your day clothes. This was another sign of wealth, having clothes just for sleeping. The lord or lady would climb into the high bed. The curtains might be drawn shut by a servant, and a candle or small oil lamp might be left burning low for a little while, casting flickering shadows on the stone walls or timbered ceiling before being blown out. Waking up was different too. A servant might come in to open the shutters, rebuild the fire, and bring warm water again. You'd get dressed in your proper clothes for the day, maybe with help. It was a slower, more private start than jumping up from the straw and getting straight to work. For a rich merchant in Bristol looking out over the River Avon, or a lord waking up in his castle near Hadrian's Wall, this separate room with its big curtained bed was pretty much the best sleep you could get. It wasn't perfect by today's ideas, still drafty, still potentially buggy, still smelling a bit of smoke and rushes, but compared to sleeping on straw in the main room, it was a world apart. It showed your status. Having your own sleeping space, a big soft bed with curtains, and fine linen sheets was what being wealthy meant for sleep in medieval England. It wasn't for everyone, just the people with money or power. Everyone else made do with the floor or a simple straw tick in the common room. But for those who could afford it, this was the way. A quiet room, a high bed, curtains drawn. That was comfortable sleeping back then. Okay. That covers where the better-off people slept. So, people in medieval England went to sleep when it got dark. Mostly. But the night wasn't always just one long stretch of sleep until morning, like we often think of it today. Especially for regular folks sleeping in that one main room, the night could be broken up. It wasn't necessarily a solid 8 hours of quiet rest. First off, it was really dark. Like really dark. There wasn't street lighting outside your little half-timbered house in a village near Stonehenge or down some lane in London. Inside, after the hearth fire died down to embers, the only light might be from a small, dim rushlight, basically a reed soaked in animal fat, or maybe a tallow candle if the family could afford it, which many couldn't. These gave off a weak, flickering light and lots of smoke. They weren't left burning all night. They were expensive and a fire risk in houses made of wood, wattle, and daub with thatch roofs. So mostly people slept in near total darkness, especially away from the faint glow of the hearth. The only sounds might be the wind whistling through gaps in the walls near Hadrian's Wall, or the occasional animal noise outside, or the bells from a distant church like St. Paul's in London tolling the hours if you were close enough to hear them. People woke up during the night for various reasons. One common reason was simply needing to use the toilet. Most houses didn't have indoor plumbing. Instead, people used a chamber pot kept in the corner of the room. It was just a simple pot. Using it in the dark, with everyone else sleeping nearby, was just part of life. The smell could get noticeable, especially towards morning. In towns like York, near the Ouse River, or London near the Fleet Ditch, the general smell outside wasn't great anyway, so an indoor pot wasn't the biggest issue. Someone would have to empty it outside in the morning, often into a communal ditch or cesspit. Not pleasant, but normal. Another reason to wake up was the cold. Especially in winter, the embers in the hearth might not give off enough heat. Drafts were common. Someone, often an adult, might need to get up to add more wood or peat to the fire to stop everyone from freezing. This meant stumbling around in the dark or by the faintest light, trying not to step on sleeping children or the family dog that might be curled up near the warmth. The damp English chill, seeping in from places like the fens or the moors, could be bone deep. Sometimes people woke up because they just woke up. Lying on a scratchy straw pallet under rough wool blankets wasn't always super comfortable. Maybe someone snored. Maybe a baby cried and needed feeding. Maybe you heard rats scurrying in the thatch above you, a common problem everywhere. From peasant cottages near Canterbury Cathedral to slightly better houses in Bristol. Maybe the straw was itchy. Or maybe the noises of the city at night filtered in. The watch calling the hour near the London Wall, distant arguments, or animals moving in the street. In castles like the Tower of London, you might hear the changing of the guards or distant noises from the River Thames. There was also this idea that some people slept in two chunks. They might go to sleep soon after dark, sleep for a few hours, then wake up for an hour or so in the middle of the night. This watch period, as some called it, wasn't necessarily planned. People might lie awake quietly, talk softly with their spouse if they were awake, maybe pray, check on the children, have a simple snack like bread, or even do a quiet chore like mending by the faint firelight if they had a rushlight burning. Then, after this period of being awake, they would go back to sleep for the second half of the night until dawn. This wasn't everyone, all the time, but it seems to have been a pattern for some people, especially before artificial lighting made long, unbroken nights more common. It was just a natural way the night sometimes unfolded. For the very religious, there were set prayers during the night. Monks in monasteries like Westminster Abbey would get up for services like matins in the middle of the night. Ordinary people living near such places might hear the bells calling the monks to prayer, but they usually didn't get up for formal prayers themselves unless they were particularly devout. More commonly, if someone woke up feeling scared or anxious, maybe from a bad dream or the howl of a wolf, rarer by the late Middle Ages, but still possible in remote areas, or just the general uncertainty of life, they might say a prayer quietly to themselves before trying to go back to sleep. Dawn came early in summer, late in winter. People generally got up with the light. There wasn't much point trying to do things in the dark. The first person up, often the woman of the house, would stir the embers in the hearth, add fuel, and get the fire going again. The smell of smoke would start to fill the room, replacing the quieter, colder smells of the night. The chamber pot would be taken out and emptied. The straw on the floor might be kicked aside or swept roughly. The room, which had been a sleeping space, quickly became the living and working space again. People put on their outer clothes over the layers they slept in, ate a simple breakfast, and started the day's work. The night was over. It hadn't been a silent, undisturbed movie sleep. It had been a practical, sometimes interrupted period of rest in a dark, often cold or uncomfortable environment, punctuated by the basic needs and noises of life in medieval England. Whether you were near the ancient stones of Avebury or hearing the bells of York Minster, the night brought its own rhythm, different from the day, but not always the deep, unbroken sleep we imagine. It was just how nights were back then. People accepted the interruptions and the darkness as normal parts of life. Okay. That covers how the night passed for sleeping folks back then. So, people back in medieval England didn't just sleep. They had some thoughts about it, and especially about dreams. It wasn't like today where we might just shrug off a weird dream. For them, sleep and dreams could mean something more, tied into their beliefs about the world, God, and the things they couldn't see. Most folks, whether living near the old stones of Stonehenge on the Salisbury Plain, or in a cramped house hearing the bells of St. Paul's in London, believed sleep was necessary. It was when your body rested and got its strength back after a long day working in the fields near Canterbury, or hauling goods by the Thames docks. Without sleep, you couldn't work properly the next day. That was pretty much the basic, practical view. Going without sleep too long made you weak and fuzzy-headed, and everyone knew that from experience. But dreams were a different story. Many people thought dreams weren't just random nonsense. They could be messages. Sometimes, people believed dreams came from God. A dream might be a warning about something bad that was going to happen, like sickness or a poor harvest. Or it could be a sign telling you to do something. Maybe go on a pilgrimage to a place like Canterbury Cathedral or give money to the church. Churchmen often talked about important dreams in the Bible, like Joseph's dreams, so the idea that God could speak through dreams was pretty common. If you had a really strong or scary dream, you might even go talk to your local priest about it near your parish church. Whether it was a grand one like York Minster or a small village church. On the other hand, people also worried that bad dreams could come from the devil or evil spirits. A nightmare wasn't just a bad dream. Some folks thought it was literally a mare, an evil spirit, sitting on your chest while you slept, making it hard to breathe and giving you frightening visions. People living near places associated with old stories, like the wild moors around Dartmoor or the deep forests near Sherwood, might be especially likely to think about spirits causing bad dreams. To protect themselves, some might say prayers before bed, or hang special herbs near where they slept, like over the straw pallet in the main room or near the curtained bed in a merchant's house in Bristol. There were also ideas about dreams predicting the future, or revealing hidden truths. A dream about finding money might make someone hopeful about their luck turning around. A dream about a relative who had died might be seen as that person visiting from the afterlife, maybe giving advice or asking for prayers. This kind of thinking wasn't approved of by the church all the time, but it was pretty common among regular people trying to make sense of things. You might hear folks chatting about their dreams down by the River Ouse in York, or while waiting to sell goods at a market near London Bridge. People also paid attention to how they slept, sometimes. Sleeping on your right side was often thought to be better than sleeping on your left. Some old ideas, passed down from even earlier times, linked different sleeping positions to different moods or health. Doctors back then, who believed in things like bodily humors, might think too much sleep made you sluggish and cold, while not enough sleep made you hot and irritable. But for the average person sleeping on straw near Hadrian's Wall or in a Cotswold village, it was more about whether you felt rested or not, rather than complex medical theories. For most ordinary people, though, the main thing about sleep was still just the practical need to rest. Whether you were a fisherman sleeping in a hut near the coast, hearing the sea, or a blacksmith in Warwick near the castle snoring after a long day, you needed sleep to function. The thoughts about dreams and meanings were there, floating around, maybe discussed on a slow Sunday afternoon or after a strange night. But the daily reality was simpler. You worked hard. You got tired when the sun went down, helped along by the curfew bell in towns. You slept as best you could on whatever you had, and you got up to work again when it got light. The deep thoughts about God or spirits sending dreams were probably more for when a dream was really unusual or scary. Most nights, sleep was just sleep. A dark, quiet period to recover in their small, smoky homes scattered across England, from the damp fens to the rolling downs. It was a break from the hard work, and that was important enough on its own, without always looking for hidden messages. But the idea that dreams could mean something was always there in the background, part of how they saw the world. Okay. That covers some of what they thought about sleeping and dreaming. Children in medieval England slept pretty much like everyone else, just smaller. There wasn't a big fuss about special kid beds or routines. It was practical, fitting into the crowded single-room life most people had near places like Canterbury Cathedral or the bustling lanes of London. Babies were often swaddled. This meant they were wrapped tightly from shoulders to feet in long strips of linen cloth. People thought this helped the baby grow straight and kept them warm and secure. A swaddled baby couldn't move much. They were usually placed near their mother on the straw pallet, or sometimes in a simple wooden cradle if the family had one. The cradle might be pushed near the hearth for a bit of extra warmth during cold nights, especially in drafty houses near places like the damp fens or up north by Hadrian's Wall. The mother would feed the baby during the night as needed, right there in the main room. The smell of smoke and damp wool was just the normal air. Toddlers and little kids slept close to their parents or older siblings. They didn't have their own little beds. They just found a spot on the shared straw pallet on the floor. If the family had a simple raised bed, the younger children might sleep there with the parents, all crammed together. Privacy wasn't a thing. Everyone slept in the same space, hearing each other breathe, snore, or stir. A child might curl up near a slightly warmer spot, maybe closer to the dying embers of the hearth, or next to an older brother. Their clothes were simple versions of adult wear, wool tunics or smocks, and they usually slept in them, just like their parents did. Comfort wasn't the goal. Staying warm and out of the way was. If they woke up scared from a bad dream, maybe hearing owls near Sherwood Forest or the distant bells of York Minster, they might just whimper quietly or shuffle closer to a parent. There wasn't usually a lamp left on. It was dark, and they learned to cope. Older kids, the ones helping with chores or even apprentices living with a master craftsman near the Shambles in York or a shop in Southwark across the Thames from London, slept where space allowed. In their own home, they still shared the main room floor or a corner of the family bed. If they were servants or apprentices in another household, they slept where the master told them to. This could be on straw in a corner of the workshop, on the floor near the kitchen hearth, or even in a loft space if the building had one. It was functional sleeping, not comfortable. They used whatever blanket was spare, which might not be much. Sharing body heat was common. Getting enough sleep could be hard if they had early chores, like fetching water from the Thames or feeding animals before dawn near a place like Runnymede. Bedtime wasn't a strict ritual. When the adults decided it was time, often after the evening meal and as the light faded completely, everyone settled down. There weren't special bedtime stories like today. Maybe a parent would tell a familiar tale or sing a simple lullaby, but mostly, kids just got tired from the day's work or play and fell asleep when it got quiet and dark. The rhythm was set by daylight and the needs of the household. If the parents were mending clothes by the faint light of a rushlight, the kids might fall asleep to the sound of their voices talking about the day's events or worries about the harvest near Salisbury Plain. Sleeping through the night wasn't guaranteed for kids either. They got cold. The straw itched. They might wet the straw or their shared bedding. They could be woken by a younger sibling crying, a parent getting up to tend the fire or use the chamber pot, or noises from outside. Animals, the night watch calling in towns like London near the old wall, or the wind howling through the thatch on a cottage near Dartmoor. If they shared the space with animals brought in for warmth in winter, that added more smells and sounds. They learned to sleep through a lot, or just lie quietly awake in the dark until they drifted off again. There wasn't entertainment or comfort offered in the middle of the night. As children grew older, their sleeping arrangements changed slowly, if at all. A teenager might get a slightly better spot on the straw, maybe near the wall instead of the drafty door. If the family was doing a little better, perhaps a farmer with good land near the Cotswolds, or a shopkeeper in Bristol. An older child might even get a simple straw tick mattress of their own, but still placed on the floor in the common room. Only in very wealthy households, like those of merchants near the Guildhall or minor nobles visiting Westminster Abbey, would children have separate sleeping spaces or small beds with proper bedding? For the vast majority, childhood sleep meant sharing the crowded, often uncomfortable main living space with the whole family, night after night, year after year. It was simply how things were done. They didn't know anything different. They slept where they were put, in the clothes they wore, waking and sleeping to the rhythms of the household and the dark English night. Whether in a smoky hut near Stonehenge or a slightly larger house hearing the bells of Canterbury. It was unremarkable, just part of growing up. There wasn't a concept of a special children's bedtime. Sleep happened when the day ended and the room got dark and quiet enough. That was it. Okay? That covers how kids slept. Over time, the way people slept in England started changing, very slowly. This wasn't like flipping a switch. It took ages, creeping along over many years, even centuries, shifting bit by bit from how things were in the earlier Middle Ages. It wasn't dramatic. Just a gradual drift towards something a little different by the time you get closer to, say, the 1500s or 1600s. Think of it like the Thames slowly changing its course over a very long time, not overnight. One of the biggest slow shifts was in the houses themselves, especially for folks who weren't dirt poor. More people, particularly in towns like London or Bristol, or successful farmers out in the countryside near places like the Cotswolds or East Anglia, began building houses with more than one room. Instead of just the single big hall where everything happened, you started seeing houses with separate spaces. This meant that sleeping could sometimes move out of the main living and cooking area. A family might have a small chamber, maybe upstairs or off to the side, just for sleeping. It wasn't always fancy, maybe just a partitioned corner or a loft space reached by a ladder. But it offered a bit more privacy than everyone sleeping together next to the hearth where the cooking smells and smoke lingered. Waking up near York Minster, you might still hear the city, but you weren't necessarily sharing your straw with the chickens anymore. The main room was still busy, but the sleepers were a bit apart. Along with more rooms came changes to the buildings themselves. Fireplaces with proper chimneys became more common, slowly replacing the old open hearths in the middle of the floor. This meant smoke could go up and out more efficiently. Sleeping in a room with a chimney meant less smoky air, which was probably a bit better for breathing, even if the room was still often chilly. Drafts were still a problem in houses made of wattle and daub near damp areas like the fens, but the air quality improved a tiny bit. Windows also saw slow improvements. While glass was still expensive, shutters became better fitted, and occasionally, small panes of glass might appear in the homes of wealthier merchants near the Guildhall in London, or prosperous wool traders in Salisbury, letting in a little light while keeping out more cold than just oiled cloth could. What people slept on also saw some minor evolution, though straw remained king for most. For families doing a bit better, simple wooden bed frames became slightly more common, even if they were just low platforms. This got people a few inches off the dirt or stone floor, away from some drafts and dampness. The straw pallet or tick mattress might be placed on this frame instead of directly on the ground. Feather mattresses, once only for the very rich like those living near Windsor Castle, started to trickle down a little further. A well-off yeoman farmer or a skilled craftsman in Norwich might save up for one, seeing it as a mark of comfort and status, though it was still a big investment. Wool blankets remained standard, but maybe a bit finer or thicker if the family could afford it. The idea of dedicated sleepwear also started to inch forward, but only for those with extra resources. While most people still slept in their day clothes or underclothes, the slightly wealthier might own a specific long linen shirt or a simple nightgown used only for sleeping. This was still far from common, but the concept of changing into something different for bed began to exist beyond just the nobility and their castles like Warwick. It was a small step towards separating sleep from the rest of the daily grind. Even the rhythm of the night might have shifted slightly for some. As more houses had better ways to light interiors cheaply, like slightly better candles, and perhaps a bit more security in growing towns or enclosed farmsteads, the old pattern of sleeping in two chunks with a wakeful period in the middle might have become less universal for some people. People might still wake up for practical reasons. A crying baby near Canterbury Cathedral kneading the chamber pot, adding fuel to the fire on a cold night near Hadrian's Wall. But the idea of a planned, quiet watching period in the middle of the night might have faded a bit for those who could afford to burn a light or felt safer. The strict tolling of the curfew bell in cities like London still dictated when respectable folks should be indoors, but the hours inside might have become a little more flexible for some. However, it's crucial to remember that these changes were incredibly slow and uneven. For a vast number of people, especially the rural poor, laborers in cities like York near the Ouse, or miners in the Peak District, life and sleep remained much as it had been centuries before. They still lived and slept in one or two cramped rooms. They still used straw pallets on the floor. They still slept in their day clothes for warmth. They still dealt with cold, drafts, insects, and interruptions. The grand cathedrals like St. Paul's might be rebuilt in new styles, but the sleep of the common person nearby changed far less dramatically. Progress was glacial and mostly benefited those already better off. So by the time you get towards the end of what we loosely call the Middle Ages and into the early modern period, sleeping in England wasn't completely stuck in the past. There were small movements towards more privacy, slightly better bedding for some, cleaner air indoors, and perhaps a tiny bit more comfort. But it was a crawl, not a leap. The basics: finding a spot, getting warm, trying to rest in a world without electric lights or central heating, remained the core experience for the majority, night after night, year after year, whether they were falling asleep to the sound of the Thames or the wind over the Salisbury Plain. The changes were real, but they were subtle and took a very long time to make even a minor difference for most folks trying to get some shut-eye. It was just the slow turn of daily life. Okay, that covers the slow changes over time. End of the final part.